Welcome everyone to our webinar today on navigating cultural and ethical differences and dilemmas in our work with families. Welcome to our presenters today, Pshko Marden, Rhett McDonald and Hala Abdelnour. My name's Amanda Kemperman and I'll be your host today. My work's with emerging minds in their workforce development team. My role is to develop resources for practitioners by sharing the knowledge and skills of practitioners and parents who are navigating cultural diversity and cultural differences while supporting children's mental health. This webinar is a part of a suite of resources for practitioners that are available on our Emerging Minds website under the subject heading Cultural Migration and Refugees. We've just recently released our latest course called Culturally Responsive Practice Strategies for Children's Mental Health, which you might like to check out. I would like to recognise and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners of the land we work, play and walk on throughout this country. We acknowledge and respect their traditional connections to their land and waters, culture, spirituality, family and community for the well-being of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. For today's webinar, we acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families as culturally and linguistically diverse. However, we won't be focusing specifically on these communities today. When we use the term CALD or culturally and linguistically diverse, we're referring to many different families who have migrated to and now call Australia home. We recognise the vast array of languages, ethnicities, nationalities, traditions, societal structures and religions across many different communities. When we use the term today, we acknowledge its significant limitations and how it may homogenise vastly different communities. It's most commonly used term in Australia and is endorsed by the Federation of Ethnic Communities Council in Australia. We use it to recognise those affected by the impacts of dominant cultural systems. I'd like to accredit the generous parents and families we work with who share their knowledge and experience and the invaluable contributions they make to our work for promoting children's mental health and wellbeing also. And we recognise all of you who have joined here today, the vast array of knowledge and practice wisdom you each hold, and we appreciate your ongoing commitment to navigating culturally respectful and anti-racist practice in your work with parent, children and families. Thank you for all of your questions. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can whilst aiming to deep dive into the richness of this work. In terms of the GoToWebinar platform today, you can access a resource list that we've put together in the Handouts tab, and you can also ask questions via the questions box. We were inundated with questions from practitioners wanting to learn more about responding to family violence and child abuse. And although we touch on this briefly, our intention is to discuss navigating cultural differences in our work, acknowledging that we each have a culture that influences our thoughts and ideas and the ways we do things. We acknowledge child abuse and violence across all cultures and are not specific to CALD communities. While these issues may exist within these communities, we find it more helpful to unpack dominant cultural ideas and systems that perpetuate racism and marginalise and create the conditions for violence to occur. Today, we explore what some of the cultural and ethical differences, dilemmas and concerns are that arise in our work with families with a cultural background different to our own, how the intersectionality of gender, faith and culture informs our ideas, beliefs and behaviours, explore how practitioners navigate their concerns whilst holding on to their values and balancing safety, wellbeing and cultural respect, how to apply a decolonising and white centralising approach, how whilst highlighting collaboratively and culturally humble and curious approaches throughout. So it's just a light one for today. I reckon these guys are up to it though. Let's start with inviting each of the presenters to share with us What stands out to them in their work with families with a culture different to their own? Pshko, what are you most drawn to in your work?
Hello, Amanda, and pleasure to be here today. There are a lot that I'm drawn to, but I'm just trying to condense into three main points. First thing is that when I'm working with people from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, there is a unique experience of life that they have that has not been formulated yet into stories and told in a way that we can learn a great deal from them. Also, kind of working in that space is always a challenge to resist thinking and practicing in accordance to one of the dominant discourse of Western culture and Western society, which is the discourse that problematize and pathologize and to some extent demonize people from cold backgrounds and cold communities, at the best turn them to a passive bodies that have no sense of agencies. The other thing that I am quite excited about is that when I work with people from cold background, in particular young people, I can sense a multitude of possibilities of new emergence of new identities. And that identity that is, it's not, it doesn't mean abnegating one's own culture, nor ossify within that culture or assimilate to the host culture. Yet it's creation of a new identity and therefore a new subculture or a culture.
Yeah, thanks, Pshko. Rhett, what's one thing that you're drawn to in your work with families?
Thanks, Amanda. Certainly in the line of work that I'm currently involved with, I think I'm probably more drawn to the client, the people who we generally refer to as clients, the people that I work with, our core communities. It's really about their abilities in the face of such oppression. I think I'm drawn to that, trying to understand that. And then secondly, I think I'm drawn to how that then informs and transforms me in how I do my work better. How I sort of convert what I hear and what I experience into learning, which informs my work, not just within the conversation I'm having at the moment, but beyond. I think that's largely what I'm drawn to. And so probably on the back of that, I want to acknowledge the people and the core communities that I do work with, because I don't have the experience of walking, amongst, in two cultures really. I don't have a lot of lived experience in this area from my own background. So everything that I sort of speak of and understand, it comes from the learnings and the understandings of what's shared with me. So I probably want to acknowledge those people and bring them into the room with me, because I speak from that position really. And I want to catch myself sometimes to not put my own understanding on things too much and really embrace where they're coming from. So that's generally what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, thanks, Rhett. Take your point about it being a reciprocal sort of journey together. Hala, what stands out to you in your work with culturally diverse families?
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for having me here. It's great to share the space with everybody, and I'm loving listening to my colleagues talk. I guess there is so much to say. Fundamentally, for me, being a human being makes, which means you're a child, you're a child to somebody. You might be a sibling, you might be a parent, and other kind of all the relations that we have. Is so intimate, within the family context. They're the most intimate spaces we occupy, whether they're positive spaces or not for us. So the capacity to work with people around their family structures, family experiences is an honor, really. It's a privilege. It's it's an invitation to enter into that space with other people. So I hold that quite sacred, that people invite us into their worlds. And as someone who migrated here as a kid with my parents, and we didn't get services. You know, I sort of see the value, having worked in settlement services when I was younger and with youth, with families, just seeing the value of that kind of support, but also seeing the damage that the sector itself can do by denying systems of oppression and denying systems of power that underpin some of our institutional structures. And so really wanting to be involved in that, and appreciating what my colleagues have been saying as well about that. And even though I do have lived experience, I don't have everybody else's lived experience. So it's always, we only speak from our own perspective to some extent, and then we bring along all the stuff we've been taught by others just through their sharing of stories. So largely it's holding this sacred and trying to do justice as much as I can to the less positive side of lived experiences, you know, and whilst acknowledging that we are mostly doing our best around those things.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everyone. We had a bit of a conversation about sharing a snapshot of a practice conversation with our participants today. And then I'll invite each of you to share your reflections. I'll ask you a couple of questions to consider, and we'll spend about 15 minutes unpacking that. Hopefully a bit of a deep dive of some of the things that are standing out for you. So a snapshot in a conversation in practice. A practitioner meets with an 11-year-old boy named Ezra. Ezra was meeting with the practitioner, describing he had feelings of anxiety and being overwhelmed. One of the reasons, he said, was because his family are preparing him to take on the role of the primary decision maker and responsibilities for the family soon. The practitioner is curious about this practice and asks if he has a choice, and he tells her that he doesn't have a choice. It's cultural, and it's something that the eldest son does at this age. At this point, the practitioner is feeling conflicted. They're concerned about the impact this will have on the child's well-being and his schooling, but also want to be culturally sensitive and respectful. Later, we'll get on to practice responses and what you might do next. But first of all, I really want to hear from you guys about what considerations you might have. What are you weighing up here? What stands out to you and why? Hala, can I start with you?
Sure. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, as if I were in a practitioner role, that I'd want to hold Ezra's experience true as how they're describing it, and factor in that Ezra is balancing more than one cultural framework in this context, and is clearly conflicted about their positioning and what's going on for them. I'd want to consider what my own cultural background is and whether this is an experience I'm familiar with or not. And I'd want to just keep monitoring what comes up in me as I have this conversation based on that, and, you know, sort of ensure that I'm not projecting either way. And that's going to be I think that's going to be a balance for the practitioner and Ezra throughout. So just wanting to create, I don't want to say like not just a safe space, but a constructive space for Ezra to unpack this experience.
Yeah, and you'd be weighing up a fair bit in your consideration of holding that space, Carla. What are some of the things that are coming to mind for you? You're hearing him talk about, you know, he's feeling overwhelmed and anxious, but it's something culturally significant and important. Yeah, what sort of comes to mind for you in considering how to navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, first off, validating that he's feeling anxious about it, and maybe just sort of holding space for that, and just acknowledging it so that it's okay to be anxious, and I guess to the point of figuring out how much I need to do with that anxiety before moving forward into a conversation. So creating some kind of measures around Ezra being able to experience that anxiety, but also maybe not necessarily be in a state of anxiety in this conversation if possible. So we might do something around that. But then I'd want to explore a little more about where Ezra's at with his understanding of his cultural background, the expectations of him, what is behind the anxiety, what are Ezra's primary concerns. So it says that the practitioner is conflicted and concerned about the impact and his schooling, and I'd want to really make sure that I understand what Ezra's concerns are, and it might be around his capacity to carry out this role, how it goes about it. Like, there could be more to the story that I don't know. Just from what's written there might be someone Ezra has to work with in the family to get that kind of learning, and they might not feel comfortable with that person. I mean, they might have to go overseas for a period of time, and they might not want to do that. Or I'd want to unpack a lot more about what Ezra's really worried about, and so that I can formulate a clearer direction about what we need to focus on in that.
And Pshko, I can see you nodding. There's lots of things resonating for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Listening to Hala talking about, we don't know yet what else might be going on, and I was kind of reading through that and thinking about respectful curiosity. Like, it doesn't need to stop there and feeling conflicted because we haven't explored yet, the family situation, what might be going on for them. Is it so the context, we haven't explored that yet to know what's that entail, what that responsibility include. But also, I want to go back into the idea, to not the idea, to the as a significant point of acknowledging and making or creating space to explore Ezra's knowledge about this decision. Because if he is an 11 years old boy overwhelmed and feeling anxious about this decision, I wonder what he knows about this decision. I wonder what sort of knowledge he has about this decision, and we need to kind of bring that knowledge into the therapeutic space for Ezra, for himself, to be kind of saying, what he knows about this decision. Because if I assume that if he didn't know what that mean, would he feel anxious? Would he feel overwhelmed with that? So there might be kind of hidden or unexplored territories of Israel's knowledge and skills that has not been captured yet. So there might be space where we could actually work with Israel, hold the space for him, but also expand that and bring some knowledge and skills that Israel has about his understanding of this decision in particular.
Yeah, and what about this sort of navigating the concern that you might have as a practitioner? This snapshot, and this practitioner is concerned about the impact that it's having on Ezra, and maybe his ability to go to school. Maybe, the impact that it's having on how he's feeling, this anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. What about that, Pshko? Like, how are you sort of thinking about that?
I think it's okay to feel conflicted. I think what we do with that is what could be considered the next important step that we might take. But it's also kind of to be looking inward, to be thinking about what is it that we hear Israel saying something, and as Hala said, like, he is clearly holding on to cultures. Is his anxiety comes from he's influenced by the Western culture, and if that might be the case, where we are, what does that say about, as a practitioners, where we are standing? Are we close? Are we curious about the other person's culture, or we are getting conflicted based on our understanding of how the other culture should be adhering to the dominant culture?
Can I add to, sorry, just with what Pshko's saying,
Great.
and I think you've definitely alluded to, Pshko, just with that last thing. And from my experience growing up here with two cultures and having worked with so many young people in the same position, when you're younger and and at this age particularly, peer relations are so important to children, and it can be the case that young people are trying to fit in with their peers, and the best way to do that is to act as Australian as possible, which would be a dominant Anglo-Celtic cultural framework. And you have families that pull you into a cultural framework that is often frowned upon by the dominant culture, and so there could be that. It's really worth exploring whether that's going on for Ezra, whether he's actually seriously concerned about the role he has to play, or seriously concerned about the relational implications of being too not Australian, like what his peers might say. So again, exploring where all the, and it'll be like lots of different areas of pressure, but really trying to get to the point of where is the pressure coming from for Ezra and how he's responding to this, and actually just being aware of what's coming up for us as workers and just parking it to the side for a second, and not sort of jumping to conclusions that just because Ezra is experiencing anxiety, this whole situation's wrong, or unworkable, or that we can't come to something with Ezra, and we have to like throw something out completely.
Yeah, and you really highlighted there the practitioner's concern and centering Ezra's concerns. Is the schooling the top of his priority list at the moment, or is it navigating one of the other many things that might be happening for him? So really understanding Ezra's experience and his concerns. Yeah, take your point. Rhett, I'll let you jump in. What stands out to you from this scenario and what you'd be thinking?
I was enjoying listening to Harla and Pshko, actually. That was lovely. I agree with everything that's been said, actually. What's got to stand out for me is what Ezra says, and it's what Ezra thinks, and it's what Ezra's interpretation is on things, because we can't assume that his feelings of anxiety and overwhelmed are associated with taking on responsibility necessarily. It might be completely something else, as Harla's just pointed out. So the big thing for me is not to assume, be interested in what Ezra says, try to understand it from his perspective. And I think if I can somehow get close to that, I think that does have an impact on my own, what might be coming up for me as a concern or a worry for him. That's how it can be alleviated sometimes, is to find the right questions to understand how he's associating everything that's going on with him to what's presented as the problem. So, I want to prioritize being as culturally sensitive as I can, to be as respectful as I can, to be as curious as I can. And I want to think about what is there in his culture that exists that makes the path safe for him stepping towards responsibility. What does his, what exists in his family that supports him, that makes that step towards that safe? Because that might be different from what the culture says. Have people, there must be plenty of other boys who've done this before. What experience and knowledge exists already out there for him? So, I think all of that sort of comes up a little bit for me. But what I absolutely do have to do is resist any urge, because I've done this in the past, and I hope I don't do it anymore, but it's to resist any urge to perhaps explain or share with him what I understand about his culture. Because what you can, as a white settler here, what I can do is that after working with people for a long period of time, I can believe that I'm understanding things. I assume that knowledge, and then I can share that to say, I know something too about your culture. And that in the past has been probably the biggest error and mistake I've ever made, because it's silenced them, it's exerted power, it's diminished their ideas of themselves and what their culture is, and it's incredibly dangerous. So, mostly I've got to learn to shut up more and listen and understand more.
Yeah, I think we could all do a little more listening in our work. Sometimes our concern might get dialed up and our eagerness to understand might be prioritized. But I'm hearing, self-reflection is also a real key part of each of how you would approach this in being aware of what's going on for yourself. Can I invite you to just maybe talk a little bit more to that? Maybe Rhett, you know, how do you sort of maintain that self-reflective practice, and what difference does that make in your work with families similar to Ezra's?
Yeah, I probably the best way to answer it is that I just have to continually work on it, and I have to remind myself constantly to when I sit down and I reflect on a session. Often we have this default position of reflecting on their situation, what they said, what's going on, and I'm forgetting all about me. I'm forgetting all about the reflection on how did I respond in that moment? How did I impact what was going on? What parts of me perhaps exerted some sort of privilege and power that wasn't useful to the situation? And I think that I generally probably remind myself that in my reflective sort of notes and things, there has to be a place reserved for me. There's got to be. And I think that's probably largely how I try to remind myself to do it. And then if I ever, and sometimes it's not always possible, but if I ever get a chance to do that also with a client or a person I'm working with, a person, I will do that. I will do that because I need to, if I've been able to structure enough safety and real understanding with people from cold communities, I need to be able to ask the questions about how am I actually presenting? How am I coming across? You know, what am I doing that's violating something or stepping on something or stuffing up somewhere? You know, and I understand that I need to have a good, safe relationship to be able to have those questions. But if I can ever get there, that stuff's really valuable to me.
Yeah. And Pshko, how does that resonate with the way that you work and reflect on your practice?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Red said earlier. And for me, self-reflection is an ongoing journey. It should happen all the time, because once I stop self-reflecting, there's when I am in these dangerous territories of seeing myself as the expert in people's life. But for me, it's the self-reflection is always looking, reflecting inwardly and thinking about what sort of thoughts and ideas and perhaps cultural beliefs and practices underpins my thinking about the other person's culture. You know, how I come to see this particular thing as something that could be admired, or as something that is problematic. So it's kind of scrutinizing and questioning our own way of thinking, both about ourselves, but also about the other. And that's the most important part of it, is because if we're not paying attention, this is when we think that we might be self-reflecting, but we still enter that dangerous territories of making assumptions about other people's beliefs and cultures and ideas.
Yeah, and I know you've spoken with me before about that about this double listening process that you do, where you're. Did you want to speak just briefly to that, and then I really want to get Hala's thoughts on this.
Yeah, so that is sort of a practice that I hold dearly in my conversation with people. Is there's always needs to be a double listening, because that's one listening is to the conversation that I'm having with a person. But when I am thinking about asking a particular question, I am having this conversation with myself, asking where this question coming from? What is my intention behind that question? You know, what sort of ideas and thoughts are behind this particular question? Are they neutral in themselves, or there is power and politics behind that particular question? And that is something that I've done a lot of mistakes, and I've learned from that mistakes. And when I'm becoming aware of that, not knowing where my question going, and just kind of thinking that, oh, I've got this particular important question that I need to ask the clients, and I see how that question unfold in the conversation where I might get into that cultural missteps. Then I need to do a lot of reverse damaging. I need to apologize. So for me, it's quite important to hold on to that double listening and having that internal conversation with myself while I'm having conversation with the person that I'm working with.
Mm-mm. And Hala, I know you've spoken about your lived experience of migrating to Australia, and lots of work you've done with migrants and refugees, and so no doubt self-reflections. Also, you're thinking about, although you've got all this wealth of experience, you're meeting with somebody, and talk me through sort of your considerations with making sure that you're not imposing your ideas and cultural understandings on people that you're meeting with.
Yeah, thank you. And I love everything that Rhett and Pshko are saying, and I don't want to repeat it. If I can add anything, just as you were asking me the question, I was thinking I could have 10 degrees, and I don't have 10 degrees. I could have 10 degrees, and I could have decades of experience of working with people, and that none of that would guarantee that I'm a reflective practitioner. The only thing that guarantees that is actually doing reflection, and it's like a muscle you have to exercise. We're not just automatically reflective. We have to practice being reflective. And unfortunately, in the welfare services sector, where we do a lot of clinical, we're doing a lot of clinical work and crisis management sometimes. And as I said, working with people in the most intimate setting, we often do that without supervision. There's no mandated supervision for our practice. And I feel like that's one opportunity to exercise that skill of reflection is with someone else who helps us to do it, like a coach, and to actually find someone, as Rhett said, that I feel safe and comfortable with, where I can actually come along and say, look, this situation presented, it was really complex. I don't know if I did it well. I said these things. I think I might have caused damage. What do you think? And actually really have those conversations, or just say I'm struggling to balance culture, my cultural frameworks with this other person's. So I would just add that it's not just I can't just trust myself to be doing self-reflection really well on my own. It's sometimes our best measure is what somebody else thinks. And if I can find someone that I trust, and we can have that mentoring, supervision, or coaching relationship, that would be really powerful.
Yeah. Thanks for your consideration of that little snapshot of a conversation. As I mentioned before, we've got so many questions, lots of great questions coming through as well. And so, Hala, I might start with you with one of the questions that has come.
Sorry, I just have like someone outside. I just have to do something really quickly.
Dear.
I'll be back in 2 seconds, but don't start with me if that's okay. I will literally be 2 seconds. I'm so sorry about this. It's just inevitable.
It's inevitable,
100%. Yeah.
That's okay. I don't have dogs barking in the background today, so that's always that's a nice thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, before moving to the questions, there was something about when we talk about cultural differences, and it's always kind of been portrayed as these differences are just differences and they are neutral. And I think then this is where we kind of get into a place where it could be damaging to our practice, because the differences are not neutral. It's more, there is a power differential, and there's a politics behind that differences that cast one particular culture in a way that is superior to the rest of the other cultures and portrays them as the inferior. So when we talk about that cultural differences, we also need to see behind that that it's not the same power dynamic and power position. It is always one being seen or believed as having the superiority over the other. And so if we are thinking about it, it's just a neutral cultural differences. We're not seeing the point behind that could actually sneak up into our practice and could create a lot of damages.
Yeah, so we're not neutral. We can't be neutral. And so through self-reflection, we're aware of what those assumptions are, those biases are, so that then we can actually minimize the effect or how and translate how they come out. Yeah. Hala and Rhett, any final comments on the case study or the snapshot in practice that we shared?
Pshko just reminded me of the power in the room, actually, and I have to be so conscious of that and make it visible sometimes where I can. And thanks for saying that, Pshko, because it's a really good reminder for people like myself. I think you've got to make it visible and you've got to make it known in the room to be able to work with it, because just by me turning up, I bring it. So.
Yeah. And Hala?
Look, I think everything we're saying sounds really great, and I just want to acknowledge it's not that easy to do, and there's a lot of confronting elements to it, and it's just about figuring out where we're at on that journey, and just what I want to develop in myself as a practitioner next. You know, do I want to develop my capacity to be culturally safer? Do I want to develop my capacity to be more youth focused? And do I want to develop my capacity to really see my power and how I exert it, or or something else in the practice? So I feel like acknowledging that this is hard work. This is part of the hardest part of our work, because I could be armed with so much intellectual knowledge, but if I don't have the interpersonal skills developed as well, then it could be damaging. It could actually not be useful.
Yeah. And we will move on. There's been a question come through just about causing offence, and I know, Pshko, that you and I have spoken about that before, about when we might have an inkling that something that we've said or something that we've done is just not landed right. And Pshko, just sort of briefly, what do you do with that?
So I mean, it's where is it in the process? Is it our thinking, or is it that we have actually said it and came out and landed, and we are kind of seeing the aftermath of it? I think in the whole process, so the double listening for me is to avoid going there. But if that's happened, I think one of the practice that I do is I check in with the person, and I will take responsibility for things that I have said and the way that I have said it that might ended up causing offense, and to kind of just address these power imbalance that I might say something and I might kind of be transparent with them, and I say, look, start a conversation with that, acknowledging that I don't know a lot of things, so please hold me accountable if I said something that you feel like it doesn't fit with your with your culture. So it's kind of creating that space where a person feel that they have the power to hold me accountable. But my preference is first is to hold myself accountable before being held accountable, because I don't want to put that burden on them as well.
Yeah, thanks. Now moving to another question, Hala, let's go to you with how you navigate different and sometimes competing understandings of gender norms and gender roles in some of your conversations.
That's a big one and a great one. And as a assigned female at birth, identify as a woman, cis person with the lived experience of that, and sort of with my own cultural background in terms of how I was raised, but also the awareness I have of the diversity of understandings around gender within my own cultural framework, let alone then the cultural frameworks I've been exposed to since coming to Australia. Primarily, I think that we live in a misogynistic world. It is run by patriarchal ideology, and it's certainly that exists to oppress women. It exists to keep women as second to men, and as subservient to men too, in so many ways. We see statistics around the world around the violence against women and girls, and by men who are known to them. So men are far more likely to be murdered, but that's when you include war-related murders and stuff. So the amount of people dying at the hands of largely men is 80% male. But when you count how many people are dying at the hands of men who are related to them in some way or in some kind of intimate relationship with them, then it's 80% female. I'm aware of those statistics. It's part of the work that I do. I'm aware of what I battle through as a woman growing up, to want to be a certain way in the world, to not want to play all the roles that were expected of me. And I hold that to a great importance. I'm also aware of and okay with other women wanting to be different, and how women navigate their journey through that in different ways. So for me, again, it comes back to how well do we understand misogyny and its impact on all of us, in the same way that I feel this just as strongly about understanding racist ideology, and that, like, we're all born into a misogynistic racist world and it impacts all of us, and we've all internalized those ideologies in different ways, and then we all navigate that as we grow up and what we want to do with it. And so I have the right to navigate it however I want to navigate it, and so does somebody else. And so for me, it's like, I have had lots of experiences, and probably the most challenging for me would be working with, and not challenging in a difficult way, but challenging in a way that excites me as in what I can develop in myself, is working with, particularly when I was younger, working with young women from the same cultural background as me who had a very different experience in life that I would have called oppressed. And even just actually them saying to me, I wish I had the freedom you had. You know, and that's in private. That's not something that's said publicly. And how we navigated that, you know, like sister to sister sort of thing. And me kind of going, I want to support you as much as I can, but I know we can't change the circumstances around you drastically. And how I can then turn that into an empowering dynamic, as opposed to let's just sit in disempowerment and helplessness. And so that's something I'm passionate about. And I'm just quickly too, because I work with men, I've done a lot of work with men over the last 20 years, and where men want to sort of justify and excuse their behaviors, and they'll say things to me like, oh, that's our cultural background, like, or you know, you come from there, you know what it's like. And how I navigate that, because there's a male asking me to accept the oppression of females as a female, and I can't do that, but I don't want to disrespect what they're saying. So I might just, so it's always for me about, how did you arrive at that? Where does that idea come from? What do you think it's like for someone else? If you could go back in time and choose to be born male or female, which would you choose? Why did you say that? What do you think your life would be like if you'd been born female? And I just want to, for me, empathy is huge. Like, we don't change our behavior without empathy, no matter what it is we're doing. So I really, like, that's probably my greatest struggle, to not impose or project, and that's how I do it, is like, let's have a chat about it. I'm okay with you thinking what you think, and I understand it's come from however you've grown up. I don't say this out loud, I just accept that all perspectives are valid because they come from lived experience. And then I just want to talk, like, what do you think it's like? Is there another way? If there were another way, what would it be? What leadership can you play in that? So I don't know, it's a long answer, but I think it's a big question, and a great one.
It's a big question. So some questions that might invite some curiosity, some exploration, some understanding further. Yeah. Hey, Rhett, let me invite you into this. Understandings around gender norms and gender roles that might be different to your understanding in your family and culture. What are you weighing up and thinking through, and how are you navigating that?
Yeah, wow, it's a, oh my goodness, how long have we got?
You've got 1 minute.
Right. You know, it's going to be a pretty, it's not simple, but it's going to sound like a simple answer, but it is this idea of me trying to be as silent as I can, and to listen and learn, and to try to get to a point where we can make visible in the conversation what impact I'm having. And I have to attend to that all the time, because I'm aware that my white Western ways are coming from a dominant culture, and I have all the privileges of that. All the rules were made for me, and to try to break that power down in a relational way with a person from a cold community, who may already be a victim of oppression, you know, it's a big task to take on, but we've got to take it on. And it's me, and I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm going to stumble, and I'm going to fall, and I'm going to have to make repair. But if I don't attend to it, nothing changes. And if nothing changes, then what am I doing in the work?
Pshko, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, well, that's a question that cannot be responded in a minute, and I think that Hal and Brett, they just smashed it in an affirmative way. For me, just kind of adding to what's been said is, the question is always how to be an ally, how to make a stand against these patriarchal ideas that is damaging, and it also causes pain to the man themselves, because a man ends up alone and thinking about, well, why I'm here, and I feel like sometimes in a therapeutic context where I've been, Hala mentioned that, like, I've been like recruited into that idea. Oh yeah, you are from that place. You know what I'm talking about. And it's like, then I have to take a curious approach, and make a clear stand that actually this is not my way of thinking about life, and this is not my way of thinking about myself as a man or as a male in society. But also, while making that clear, inviting these men and having the counter invitation, and inviting him to thinking about his own ethics. Is this way of being or thinking, is it helping him to have a better relationship with people that he claims that he loves them? So that kind of trying to engage them in that sort of conversations where it's more inviting them into a more of an ethical space.
Mm. And so then too, another sort of similar but different question, and we had lots of questions come through around family violence and harm against children. Pshko, let me start with you about responding to where there is a cultural difference, and there's family violence and children are being harmed. Talk me through your thinking processes there.
I think one of the dangerous assumptions, and I've heard that a lot, and that might be underpinning a lot of questions that comes, and we've been asked all the time, is that domestic violence is something happens within cold communities. or it's more kind of dominant there, where, if we just take a simple statistics that the calls, according to Australian Bureau of Police report, that the calls that been responded to by police is the almost over 90% is in relation to DV. So to me, to think about that, it's DV, it's a global pandemic. I don't know whether that you can say a global epidemic, or it's a global phenomenon, and it's happened within every culture. So if we are focusing on that, oh well, actually this is happening with that culture, I'm wondering whether that we'd be missing the point where it's actually happening everywhere. And as Hala mentioned, that it's a patriarchy. It comes from patriarchal ideas, and so it's a widespread. And we need to kind of go to the source of where is it actually coming from, rather than picking up on a minority group and say, well, this is actually happening only over there, and it's not happening elsewhere. I'm not sure whether I'm responding to that question.
Yeah, and so you'd be quite clear around family violence and child abuse and your response in that. And it sounds to me like you'd be really clear that you wouldn't dismiss it as cultural, you wouldn't excuse it away as cultural, that there would be some responses that you would have where there is family violence and child abuse.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the issue is goes beyond culture. It's a global pandemic for me, because it's not just one culture explicitly doing, although it might be more dominant in one culture over the other, but it's not only a cultural thing. It's happening in one culture. So and also with any culture, culture could have a lot of binding and kind of affirmative ideas and practices, but also any culture could also have some problematic ways of relating, the members relating to one another. So to distill it down to say that is only cultural practices, I think there is a risk and there's a danger in that.
Yeah. Hala, I want you to jump in here. I know you dedicate a lot of your time and thought and energy in this space. How do you respond when you're working with a cowed family and there's family violence and child abuse?
I respond the same no matter who I'm working with, and I do work in that space. And one of the things I point out to people, a couple of things I point out is, having worked in the men's behaviour change space, there's a lot of Anglo-Australian men coming to those spaces. And so it's definitely not a cultural issue. Well, it's a cultural issue in every single culture, and it's what ideologies are embedded in those cultures, which are any ideology about power over. So gender is identified globally as a big one, but I do think there's space for us to talk about racial power imbalances, ability, ageism, gender heteronormativity and cis heteronormativity also come into play, as well as other factors. So what power am I given by society that is associated with my personal traits, and how can I be abusing that power? So that's one thing, is in my understanding of it. In how I work with people, it's the same. It's applying curiosity in, like, a lot of what we're talking about. What's going on? What do you want to work on? What are your goals? Building insight and awareness that this is the behavior, and you have to do that really slowly over time. And then understanding the impact. So if I'm working with someone who's using violence, it's about understanding the impact they've had on others, and keep linking back to their goals as a partner and as a parent, and what they want to achieve. So there's that. And whenever culture is mentioned, it's sort of, how's that relevant to you? Like, I wouldn't discount culture or throw it out of the room, but I certainly wouldn't allow it to be used as an excuse for violence, because that's avoidance behavior, really. There's other dynamics going on. And that's really in intimate partner violence and maybe other adult-to-adult violence. And we have this other issue that's come up throughout my career in Australia, where child rearing practices and disciplinary practices are considered child abuse in Australia by law, as well, which reflects the cultural framework in Australia. And interestingly, there's a lot of people who migrate here and observe and learn about the Anglo-cultural framework of child raising and family, and think it's beneath theirs. That they don't think it's you know, what do you mean you throw kids out when they're 18? Like, there's all these things we hear, right? So there's stuff where some of those things about how do you raise kids, how do you talk to people, you know, like there's so many nuances to culture that we're raised within the framework of what's right and what's wrong. That's actually how we teach our kids. That's how we learn. That's how we grow up. This is the right way to do it. This is the wrong way to do it. And so when we get exposed, as we have been through globalization, to different cultural frameworks where my wrong is your right and your right is my wrong, we get into a conflict. And what we have in Australia is a dominant culture that has set the laws, set the guidance, set everything. And so then you has the power to say that's wrong. And I'm not condoning harm to any children. I know what psychologists would say is really good child raising behavior, but we have to be mindful that everybody holds on to these things as sacredly right or wrong. And so we're all in conflict with each other about this. And at the end of the day, it's the children that matter. So it's not helpful. Well, this is where reflection really comes in. What do I hold true? What do I hold to be actually incorrect? And then this is someone else's correct way to do things. So how do I enter that conversation for the sake of the kids? So yeah, I could lock you up. I could send child protection over to your house. I could do all these things. None of that's useful in the long term. What's everyone learning? So we can certainly get a bit more sophisticated in how we have interventions where we feel like children might be harmed, and keep reminding ourselves that child protection laws, family violence laws, all the court systems and all justice and legal practices existed here before all the CALD communities came here. So they exist also for the white Australian population.
Yeah, thanks, Hala. I've just looked at the time and went, whoa, that just flew. We've got a few minutes left together. We have so many questions, but we actually have a bonus recording where we will be answering more of your questions, and that will be available alongside this recording in a couple of weeks on both the Australian Institute of Family Studies and the Emerging Minds website. I hope you found today's conversation generative of some new ways of approaching your work where there's cultural differences and there might be some concerns. Don't forget to check out the latest course, Culturally Responsive Practice Strategies for Children's Mental Health. I will offer each of you a final, I think we've got 30 seconds to just share one sort of key takeaway message that maybe you just wanted to share again. Rhett, over to you.
Well, probably the biggest thing for me is trying to privilege the discovering of something first time as a clinician over the idea of knowing or defining something, and trying to understand things in the context of how they're being presented. Because if you can understand the context, their behaviour will make sense to you.
Yeah,
that's it.
Powerful words. Hala.
I'm gonna say perhaps consider, if you don't already have one, consider a mentor, supervisor or coach that you can continue to unpack this with, a companion on your journey, on your professional journey, and thinking about areas that you'd like to develop as a professional, so that, you know, we don't spend our careers just reinforcing bad habits or staying stuck in the same loop. So I think we can together learn more and evolve in our practice.
Yeah, and Pshko, final comment.
Yeah, I think this is an invitation. It's a practice that I am, or thinking practice that I'm doing myself, but I'm also inviting other practitioners and workers to join me in, which is that viewing culture as a living entity, as a living organism that is always changing and evolving, and not kind of try to think about it as a rigid structures that never changes. So this is kind of quite important, because when we do that, this is where we again enter that dangerous territory. So yeah, thinking of culture as a living organism.
Yeah. Thank you, each of you, Hala, Pshko and Rhett, for your practice wisdom and insights. Thank you to all of you tuning in, and for all of your amazing questions and your commitment towards culturally responsive practice and supporting children's mental health. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now. Welcome to our extended Q&A with our presenters, Rhett McDonald, Pshko Barden and Hala Abdelnour. We've got a couple more questions that we've got time to share with you. Let's start with you, Rhett. How do you navigate families' cultural preferences when they might be different to your understandings?
This question actually reminds me of the work of Vicki Reynolds, and I think she's given some real valuable insights to the work in this area. And she talks about this idea of structuring safety, rather than safety being something that's just, you know, stated in a policy or procedure or handed out in a confidentiality leaflet to clients and people we work with. Structuring safety is the work we do. It's not something you do and then get to the problem presented to you. So I think for me, it comes back to this idea of, does where I'm meeting them create a sense of safety? I know with core communities, I've had more success running sessions outside my office than in. They've been far more successful to me, and hopefully them. How am I presenting myself? Does that foster some sort of sense of safety? I'm also sometimes aware of how I locate myself culturally in a session too. Yeah, I think often we have this expectation that we meet clients and we have to find out where they're from, what language they speak, their ethnic backgrounds, what religion, the whole gamut of that sort of thing, but we share nothing of that from our own perspective. And I sometimes feel that it's really important for me to say that, you know what, I'm a white settler on lands that was never ceded. And I've got ties to British and Scottish and German heritage, and I was christened Catholic as a young kid. You know, I'm bringing all this to the room as well. And I sometimes think that's important to structure safety, to talk about that sort of stuff. So I think that's important. I think we have to talk about what do I need to know about what's sacred and valuable and precious to you, so I don't put my foot in it from your perspective. Yeah, what can we, you know, what hopes do we have about how we're going to behave in these meetings that we have? You know, what's, and really importantly actually, what history do they have of disagreeing with someone in power, with disagreeing with someone who's perceived to be an expert or a clinician or someone of that nature? You know, how would we know if we've stepped on something in a session that's violated something we agreed with? You know, what responsibility am I going to take to be accountable to catch myself when I think I've crossed a barrier or I've violated something? And if I'm not aware of it, how can I become aware of it? How can I get a subtle reminder from someone in the room, perhaps, that that's what's happened? So I think all that stuff around structuring safety is really, really important. And I have to try to understand my own blocks and my own obstacles, and understanding my own privilege in the room, because what we're doing here is relational. It's really relational. And I remember there was a time when I was a clinician where I just stayed within what I knew, within what I was familiar with, and I responded from that position. And it took me a while to work out that that was not relational. Because if I'm not opening up to grow myself, to learn from them, to understand them and expand my own horizons, then I'm not being relational in that work. So that's why I sometimes try to focus on privileging, like I said previously, privileging discovering something for the first time over knowing something or defining something. Because I think when we do that, if I'm able to do that, then I'm starting to do dignity, and I'm starting to be open to my own transformation, and I'm starting to become more aware of the context with which the context of what's happening for the clients, and then I'm going to be able to understand their behaviour more. So that's the sort of stuff that comes to my mind when you ask that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rhett. And Pshko and Hala, I know that you've talked about some of the ways that you navigate different cultural understandings and maybe family practices. Any sort of standout things you wanted to share in addition to what Rhett has said? Pshko, do you want to start?
Okay. Well, just adding to what I've heard from Rhett, and it's beautiful. Thank you, Rhett. It's that the idea of structuring safety, and for me, is to think about what is it that I am actually bringing into the room. In conversation with colleagues, I've heard a lot that when we go to a therapy room, we tend to leave our own biases, our own prejudice, our own ideas behind the door. And to me, the question is, we will leave those prejudices and biases we know of, and what are some of the things that we don't know of? And so it's for me to acknowledge that there might be things that I am yet to discover about myself or my practice. That could be useful, but that also could be problematic. And so kind of paying attention to, why I'm kind of approaching conversation, why I'm responding, how the conversation unfolds, why I am thinking about what is going on, and, also thinking about the alternative ways of what might be going on for the person. So this is kind of the more kind of broader but kind of specific in the therapeutic context. The other thing that I am embracing is the idea of not knowing. I think that is quite valuable, because if we approach any work with the idea that we have a knowledge and we left nothing for curiosity, and so then we might get calcified in what we know. And so as Red was saying, so there is this urge to get out of what we know and learn things about the other and learn things about ourselves. So in that, not knowing is a valuable thing. It's what kind of drives the respectful curiosity for me.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Pshko. And Hala, something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm just listening to Rhett and Pshko, and yeah, I love Vicky Reynolds. I think she's added so much value to this sector, and the idea of how we balance all the different things. One thing I'm thinking about just listening to this conversation, and I have thought about this growing up here, is the as difficult as it is to be a migrant from a very different cultural background and being asked to assimilate, and even though we don't use that word anymore, that's actually what we're being asked to do. We're still being asked to assimilate into Australian society, because the more anglicized you can become, or the more Anglo you can act in Australia, the more you'll thrive and be successful. And that's not an easy thing to do, because you have to understand a cultural framework that's different to your own. You do have to balance conflicting right way of doing things, and you navigate your way around that. You've got to figure out different ways of how you talk. Do you challenge authority? Don't you? Is it okay? Like all these things that we have to navigate, and we're forced to do it, so we get really good at it. And then I get good at adapting to other cultural frameworks when I come across them, because I've had to. And it's just dawned on me that a lot of the struggles that people who are represented by the dominant culture have when working with people from other cultural backgrounds is no one's asking them to assimilate to anything in this country, and so they're not well practiced at it. And there's no pressure to. You could actually very comfortably sit and say, no, you just be more like me, and then you'll be fine. But the truth is that's never going to work. It's not working. And so it's like, how can I adapt to your cultural framework? How can I meet you halfway? What do I need to know about you and know about myself? And it starts with understanding, and somebody said this earlier, starts with understanding that you've got a cultural background too. We all do. And that there's just as many understandings of the world and cognitive constructs that I hold that are embedded in my cultural framework that I was raised with as anybody else. That's just true for all human beings. And when the dominant culture represents me, it's much harder for me to see that. And it's much easier for me to just sit back and go, no, you be more like me. And that's the problem that a lot of people have, is someone's walking into their office and they're going, I don't get you, be more like me. And it's like, no, how can I meet you where you're at? And I have that. I meet people who are culturally different to me, but it's not daunting anymore for me. It's just easier because I'm well practiced at it. So it's like anything in life, if you exercise it, you get better at it.
Yeah, thanks, Hala. And I know we've only got a few minutes together, so I want to get in as many questions, but you guys are doing such a great job at answering these huge questions. Hala, what does it mean to apply an intersectional feminist approach in your work? Just another little question for you.
Sure, just a small one, but it ties in, I guess it ties in with what I was just saying, what we've been talking about. And look, the fundamental thing I want to say is, if you're talking about intersectionality and you don't know who Kimberly Crenshaw is, then you're not talking about intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, and she was very specific in what she meant by it. And she was talking about systems and structures of oppression. She wasn't saying, do you have different identities and lived experiences, therefore you have intersectionalities. She was saying, how are systems and processes structured in a way that are a vehicle for oppression or privilege for people based on their personality traits. So if I'm just talking about gender and skin color and religion and all the other things without the context of systems of processes and systems of privilege and oppression, then I'm not actually talking about intersectionality. I'm talking about diversity. And diversity is a fact, but equity and inclusion is a choice. And equity and inclusion happens when we assess the systems we've got in place and whether, Rhett, you said earlier, the rules are made for me. It's easy. That's what we're talking about. Are the rules, and if they're not made for you, then how are they oppressing you? And so when we get a client that comes in and it's, it's whether we want to talk about how they're raising their kids or family relationships or how they're navigating the system in Australia, if I don't understand that system was designed by white men for white men and later is now including white women and other white existences and is favoring that above everything else, then I'm not going to acknowledge that this person might be experiencing oppression systemically. And that's what it means to apply an intersectional feminist framework, because feminism exists to specifically to dismantle the patriarchy and specifically to dismantle powers of inequities. And so I'm looking at this from that perspective of what inequities exist, where do they sit in the system, and what's my role in the system, what power have I got, and who are you, and what's your life experience been, and then I go from there. In a nutshell.
Yeah, and you did an amazing nutshell version of that. Thank you so much. One last question, Pshko, I'll start with you about challenging a man choosing to use violence against his partner and claiming that it's normal in his culture.
Yeah. Okay. So the way that to respond to that question is we think that it's in our authority to be challenging a man about his way of being. And again, that's what does give us that power to be doing that? And is it actually gonna do any good? Is us confronting a man and challenging them about their ways of being, it is going to achieve the desirable outcome, or they feeling that they will be more targeted, marginalized as a result of our approach. So to me, it's not that, and it doesn't mean that we should leave it and we should do nothing about it, because as Hala mentioned earlier, is that and I'm getting that that's been part of our conversation, is we are resisting the binary that it's right and wrong, and always my way is right and your way is wrong. It's always kind of that division. So how kind of we can meet halfway? And to me is, and that's this kind of a question, how we could create an ethical platform for this man to stand on and be able to reflect and critique their own ways of being. So how we could kind of collaborate with man, how we could create that ethical platform and invite this man to be looking into his own ways of being that is problematic. So it's not challenging him, but it's inviting him to be able to challenge his own ways of being. And that's very different. That is more kind of invitational. We do that, and regardless of is it a white man or a man from a cold background, and I guess the only difference is that white men, they know the language, they know the system, they know how to navigate themselves out of that troubles, where those sort of ways might not be available for a man from a cold background. So then the pressure would be way higher than on them. So it's my way of engaging with people is how to work with them to create that ethical platform so they could critique their own ways of being and try to see the alternatives of being a different man.
Yeah, and I know you've provided some great resources in the resource handout that we will put together on invitational approaches and exploring curiously and value-driven practice and so on. So I encourage all of our participants to follow up with some of those great resources. Thank you all for your contributions, your wisdom, your commitment to your work for children and families. And look forward to maybe having another chat, another webinar, another time, hey? And look forward to seeing you all listening again another time as well. Bye for now.